the way in which the poem has its own being, stands outside you, acts on you. You don't quite know what to do with it, but a kind of exchange has taken place. I would think of that almost as a kind of ecological relation.
Hi, Conor. Thank you for being here with me today for our podcast on Rilke.
Thanks so much for having me.
But before we dive into the Rilke topic, can you please introduce yourself? Because you do literature as a job, is that right?
Sure, yeah, it's kind of a strange state of affairs. I'm not always sure how I ended up here. But yeah, my name's Conor. I'm a German lecturer here in Oxford at Jesus, based in the college we are in now. And I'm from Ireland originally. Did my other degrees there in Dublin, Trinity College Dublin. And how I've ended up in German is genuinely quite a strange question for me. I have no connection to the country or to the language, except that I always wanted to study English. And when I was choosing another subject to go along with it, I was told that German would make me more employable, and that's why I picked it originally. And it was only really when I got to university. So in Ireland, we do more subjects than A-level. We do up 7 to 9 subjects. And that means that when you're studying a language, it's really only comprehension. It's really, grammar, listening comprehension, reading comprehension. It was only really when I got to university and started reading literary texts in German that it kind of grabbed me, and that I sort of felt the urge to go study there, live there, and then gradually Germany kind of drew me in more and more, and that's how I've ended up here.
How do you feel as a reader? I mean, this is something we might do in private, and then some of us, like you and I, we choose it as a job.
Yeah, I mean, I always loved reading. When I was a kid, I always wanted to be a writer. I was always writing stories. And actually, I realized when I was thinking about this conversation that the first encounter I ever had with Rilke was through one of my teachers in school. So in my teenage years, I wrote a lot of poetry, pretty awful love poetry for the most part.
Same for me.
Oh yeah,
here
really?
we are.
It's a rite of passage, you've got to do it. And some of that, to my kind of enduring shame, was published at the time in a newspaper in Ireland. And my teacher in school, my Irish teacher, who was a kind of published poet and novelist in Irish, held me back one day after class to ask, could I stay after class? Which I assumed meant I was, had done something wrong with the homework or something like that. But it turns out that he had read the poems, wanted to give me some very solid advice, including not to use the word love directly in the poem, if you could help it, to kind of show, not tell, which is, excellent advice for anyone out there currently going through that adolescent phase. But then he also gave me a kind of photocopy of Letters to a Young Poet, English translation, which was the first Rilke that I ever read. And I think there's something really nice about encountering Rilke that way, as kind of practical advice. Obviously, these aren't the poetic texts that we would kind of read and analyze, but they're nonetheless very kind of warm, readable texts with a lot of with quite a lot of literary value as well. And encountering them in that way, far removed from the world of kind of professional German studies, what we do, was a really nice. Yeah, it was a really nice first way of reading Rilke, and thank you to Maestro MacCord and Ecology and in Donegal for imparting that wisdom. And then how I went from kind of writing creatively to sort of doing this as a job, doing literary criticism as a job, was through my studies and kind of finding that was a different way of engaging with and thinking about literary texts, and a different way of writing as well, different way of... it's quite a creative act, I think, criticism. And I found that just, if I'm completely honest, it's sort of a way of staying close to the encounters with the literary text. It's a way of getting to read as my job, also with students, sitting in a room, showing them a text and seeing how they respond. That's what keeps me interested and keeps me wanting to do this job more than all the kind of all the sort of quirks of the profession, like how you produce conference papers and write articles and all the rest. So that's how I've kind of made the transition. And sadly, I don't write creatively that much anymore.
I was about to ask about that.
Yeah, no, not really. I think in some ways university kind of it's not that studying killed it for me. It's more that I kind of did publish a bit with then student journals and stuff like that in Dublin, and found that I kind of felt very judged or observed, lost my kind of authentic relationship to writing in some way, and now I feel very self-conscious when I try. But I have it in the kind of back of my mind as a sort of hobby or a pipe dream for later on when I have time.
Do you remember that authentic feeling when you first wrote poetry? Because that's a quite specific form of writing, like you could have written prose on love, and I could have, and we didn't, it was poetry. Yeah. Why?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And now, so in terms of my own research, I work much more on prose. I don't really look at poetry that much in what I kind of publish academically. And part of that is that some people do say that reading academically has reduced their joy in what they read. And I think for a lot of people that means fiction. For me, I don't really experience that. I think it actually enhances my enjoyment of the fiction that I read. But for poetry, somehow I've kept them kind of separate. The academic study of it and the kind of reading. So poetry is partly where I struggle most, as my students will attest, to explain why I can see what's amazing about a poem, but communicating how it works and explaining its meaning to me always feels kind of more sacrilegious than with a fictional or a prose text. For some reason, it feels more like you're picking it apart. And that's not to say, when it's done well, I really admire it, this kind of exegesis of poetry, but I find it really difficult. Often because a poem really does affect me in a particular way that still feels, it's obviously not immediate in that the whole poetry is in language and active mediation, but it feels, I don't know, I still have that feeling that it is kind of working on me as I read, and that I don't quite know what to do with it.
And I like that, as I always think about whether we should understand poems logically, and of course we have the tools, we could do so. Like you, I have decided to do something different in my research. I don't do it logically with poems because I don't want to touch them in that way. And like you, I admire it when others do it.
Yep.
Like Charlie, who joined us for another podcast episode. He's fantastic, and I could listen forever to him doing it. But I don't dare to do it. I want to have it. I give space to poetry in my life at some point, and somewhere, and I keep it, as you say, in a safe space in a way. Yeah. And I think that it's one way of giving space to poetry that I think we can appreciate. That's one way of doing it, isn't it?
Yep. One of the ways I think about this is, so my research, while it's on prose, is on, I do what's called ecocriticism. So I think a lot about the relationship between literature and the physical world in the broadest possible sense. So often it is, they are topics that someone like Rilke is quite interested in. So the relationship between a poem and an animal, for instance, or a poem and a plant, which we see in some of these selected texts. But it's not really, I think when you mention eco-criticism or an environmental reading of texts, often people think of nature poetry or a way of writing that's supposed to show us nature as kind of beautiful, pristine, separate from us in a way, in that it's kind of untouched and intact and what we should aspire to but not be involved in somehow. It's sort of, we're here and then the environment is that which surrounds us, but there's no interaction.
Which is not how it works, right?
No, exactly, yeah. And so I think this, Rilke is really, really interesting in this regard, in the way that he deliberately makes poems into things that then work on us that we can't help but have a relationship with. So there is something, if we want to be sort of abstract about it, there is something almost ecological about the relationship between you and the poem, the way that it, if we say that ecology is about kind of relations between things, about being in a particular place or situated in some way vis-a-vis something else. I think that the way in which the poem has its own being, stands outside you, acts on you, you don't quite know what to do with it, but a kind of exchange has taken place. I would think of that almost as a kind of ecological relation. But again, that's a way of sort of, explaining what we know is happening.
Yeah.
This kind of,
That's what I mean. We have to reconnect with nature, for nature and for ourselves, I think. So I think it both ways in a way. Yeah. Read a lot of like Robin Wall Kimmerer, he's a biologist. indigenous biologist, and she taught me a lot how to rethink things. Yeah. And it sort of aligned with my feeling that I initially had, but then I was sort of taught otherwise, or got out of it in moving to larger cities in my case, and doing my education, all of that. So I lost it, and I found it again. And I think one way of finding it again can happen through poetry, like Rilke's. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, a lot of what you said there is really interesting, including the aspect of moving to a city, and the very idea of nature. So I think one thing that Rilke does, and particularly these poems, the Neue Gedichte, this collection, seems to do, is to disrupt our idea of nature as a kind of separate category. So it's interesting that not all of the poems in this, obviously, there are kind of many types of poems, and all of them are the so-called Gedichte, the thing poems that that a critic famously described them as. But lots of them do seem to focus on a particular object. And it's interesting that object could be an animal, or could be a statue, or a fountain, or a ball, or, in the case of the ball, I suppose it's more a process than about the object itself. But it disrupts these categories of nature being inherently different from things, and also disrupts the idea that we are separate from both, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So because of the way that the poems are really interested in how we see the world around us, but then also shows us both things and animals appearing to look back. Mm-hmm. I think it is, in a way, one of the things it seems to be concerned with is this idea that eco-critics are also really interested in, of anthropocentrism.
Mm-hmm. What is that?
That is the way in which we can only view things from a human perspective, and that we tend to center the world around ourselves, or view it as being centered around ourselves. And that's a perspective that we kind of can't escape, right? Like we have our sort of 5 main senses. We have our human brains that are evolved to work a certain way. But there's the kind of default anthropocentrism that we don't question. And then there are writers like Rilke who are intensely conscious that our perception is limited in this way, and are straining against it in all sorts of ways. So I think his constant attempts to get beyond human perception by imagining, for instance, how animals see the world, or what angels are like, those are kind of combined with quite close attention to the way human perception actually works, in a way that sort of gives us both. It's both kind of probing the actual workings of an anthropocentric perspective, and also constantly reminding us that there's something beyond, or that there's plenty that's beyond us, which is not necessarily meant in some type of spiritual way, but is meant also in terms of the physical world. That the same space we inhabit and move through would be perceived entirely differently by, for instance, other creatures, other beings.
And we learn to imagine them and their existence through reading Rilke, in a way, because he was so careful in observing.
I think
beyond.
So. Yeah, I think so. And in drawing attention to the failures as well. Mm-hmm. So one thing that I think is kind of one way in which this chimes with eco-critical ideas is in the kind of so-called crisis of language that we see in a lot of German writing around this time.
What happens there? Can you explain it, please?
Yeah. So German writers and philosophers German language, I should say, because a lot of these writers are actually Austrian, or like Rilke, kind of born in the dual monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. They become really concerned with the ways in which there seems to be sort of language as a system of human communication, and the world beyond, and sort of never the twain shall meet. They become very skeptical of the ability of language to actually lead us into things and into the world, and instead view it as sort of almost blocking us from perceiving or accessing the world around us. So that language becomes one of the things that's kind of, unique to humans in a way that's not necessarily good. That's part of our human consciousness that that blocks us from a certain type of seeing that animals seem to have more access to.
Cuts the connections that we now try to recreate.
Exactly, because we can't kind of look at we can't look at a leaf, for instance, without thinking leaf, and then immediately the word leaf is in our head, and we're looking at that familiar concept leaf rather than seeing
so we see the word,
the specificities.
Not the thing.
Yeah, we already have, because we can categorize it through language, and through through intellect, rationality, we then stop looking at it. We don't see what's specific about this leaf. We just know that it's a leaf, and that's it's a kind of becomes a shortcoming of perception that we just are quite happy with our established categories. Mm-hmm. So there's this early Rilke poem called Ich fürchte mich so vor dem Menschenwort, that's kind of doing exactly this, talking about how by naming things in a way that's unreflected, by just kind of saying, oh, that's table and that's chair and that's sky, but it's not in a way that's actually observing the thing closely, that actually the power that those things have to sort of speak to us or act on us gets, in the poem, it gets killed. So ihr bringt mir alle die Dinge um. You're killing these things for me by naming them. I think we've gone quite far from you're moving to the city and losing
That's
contact
absolutely
with
fine.
nature. I mean, it's interesting that these are also, these poems are also arising from quite an urban, early 20th century context. And I think we sort of see that even in the types of animals that we encounter in the collection. So I think in the selected text you have the panther, who's the panther, that's a kind of a caged zoo animal. And the animals we encounter are often, they're either sort of zoo animals or they're domestic animals, like the Hund, die Katze, the kind of the cats in the cathedral in Die Fensterrose. So that's another way in which this collection is interesting ecologically. It's not setting nature apart as some separate category far removed from human influence. In fact, it's kind of locating it in an urban setting that's already sort of hybrid, that's already constantly about interrelationships between humans and what's around them.
Are there any moments in reading Rilke that stayed with you personally?
Oh, yeah, so many. One that I think is really important for this particular topic of animals, but also more broadly human perception versus something beyond it. And by that, I want to stress, I don't mean necessarily on a kind of spiritual level, although that is there in Rilke's writing as well for those who want to look for it, is the opening of the 8th Duino elegy, where he talks about the idea of the open, so the way animals seem to be able to perceive, and that we as humans can't perceive that way. So we see the face of the animal and can only read from the animal what it seems to be seeing, but we can't access it ourselves. And that's a kind of that's a really famous poem, but even just the opening lines that bring together a lot of what we've been talking about and a lot of what's already there in the Neue Gedichte, in poems like Schwarze Katze, Die Fensterrose, Der Panther. So that's definitely stayed with me. But one that I read entirely, in an entirely unrelated way, just when I was living in Germany, that for some reason really moved me, is called Todeserfahrung, which actually shouldn't fit that well with my own topic of something like ecocriticism, because it does seem to suggest, it's talking about an experience of someone close to you dying, and it does in some way seem to suggest a kind of, if not afterlife, then it has a kind of metaphysical, seems to have a metaphysical sense where there's a world beyond our world that's more real. But actually, I think, so one of the things the poem is doing is using the metaphor of acting in a play. And in some ways, if you read it that way, I think it contrasts acting in a play, which is what we seem to be doing most of the time, with something more real, with grün, wirkliche Grüne, like the green of real green. And I think if we see that as more about how we live our everyday lives, doing exactly what we've been talking about with, for instance, a professional reading, that you're always in a role, taking a box in a kind of human social relationship, often not perceiving things for what they really are, then I think there's also a kind of more vital materialist, or there's a reading of this poem that doesn't have to refer to something, something beyond the material world we live in. But for some reason, I just find it really, really moving, and I use it in translation classes with students, because it's just, as with all these poems, it's one of the real reasons to learn German. It's just, poetry is the ultimate kind of untranslatable. No matter how creative we get in our approximations, it never will be quite the same as the original. So yeah, that's one that, yeah.
And you brought it with you today?
I have it here, yeah. I might, I can't promise that it's going to be a very polished reading, but here it is. It's called, it's from this collection, Neue Gedichte, and it's called Todeserfahrung. Wir wissen nichts von diesem Hingehen, das nicht mit uns teilt. Wir haben keinen Grund, Bewunderung und Liebe oder Hass dem Tod zu zeigen, den ein Maskenmund tragischer Klage wunderlich entstellt. Noch ist die Welt voll Rollen, die wir spielen. Solange wir sorgen, ob wir auch gefielen, spielt auch der Tod, obwohl er nicht gefällt. Doch als du gingst, da brach in diese Bühne ein Streifen Wirklichkeit durch jenen Spalt, durch den du hingingst. Grün, wirkliche Grüne, wirklicher Sonnenschein, wirklicher Wald. Wir spielen weiter, bang und schwer erlerntes hersagend und Gebärden dann und wann aufhebend. Aber dein von uns entferntes, aus unserem Stück entrücktes Dasein kann uns manchmal überkommen, wie ein Wissen von jener Wirklichkeit sich niedersenkend, sodass wir eine Weile hingerissen das Leben spielen, nicht an Beifall denkend.
Wow.
It's nice, isn't it?
Thank you. I actually didn't know this one until just now.
Yeah, I really like it. It kind of gets lost in all because it's not at all a kind of
it's beautiful
Gedicht or, but I love it, yeah. And even just these finer points that are impossible to get across in your translation with students. So we always struggle over der Tod in German being, it is a masculine noun in German, and it doesn't have to be personified. Whereas once you translate it into English, you have to decide whether to personify it as one of the players on stage or leave it as death. And then we have this hingehen and hingerissen being the German for, yeah, so yes, exactly. Hingerissen is the German word for kind of enraptured or transported. But here with a play on being brought to where the person has left. Yeah, it's fabulous. He's a good poet.
He is.